All right, we're gonna get started, right?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So just bear with me for a moment. I want to make sure that everybody is in the right headspace. So I want you to imagine that the driver on your factory shuttle refuses to let you on because you don't flirt with him enough. And he leaves you to walk to work amid many security risks. That you work a full day on the factory floor for low wages, generally, while also earning less than a man in a comparable position. Now I want you to picture that when you don't accept your supervisor's sexual advances, your shifts are changed, you're demoted, and that when you finally return home after a hard day's work, you're expected to pick up your second shift as caretaker and homemaker. Now, these are just some of the issues that women working in the maquilas in Mexico face. And just at the outset, the maquilas are factories that manufacture products for export. With that said, good morning. Thank you guys so much for coming. My name is Tiffany Basciano. I'm Associate Director for the International Law and Organizations program here, and I am the founder and manager of the International Human Rights Clinic. And just welcome to our 2019 report release titled Shouldering the Burden, How Free Trade Affected the Livelihoods of Women in Mexico. This report will be online if it has not made it there. It's made it to online, so to be eco-friendly, please check out the online version. We have a couple of hard copies out there for those who prefer the visual. The visual is particularly stunning this year, thanks to Karen, who is a fantastic graphic designer. So I'm just going to give a couple of brief remarks just to outline those. First, I'll introduce the International Human Rights Clinic. Then I'll go on to what this year's topic is and what our research design and limitations were. And then I will outline the report. And then to the stars of the show, I will turn it over to the students who will begin the discussion. So first on the International Human Rights Clinic, it's an experiential learning course where students learn skills to protect and promote human rights. It was founded over 8 years ago, and generally it focuses on fact-finding and reporting. We tend to focus on either novel issues or underrepresented human rights issues. I guess it adds an added dimension to working on human rights to look at those types of issues. Now, as far as this year's topic goes, what this year's topic presents is both a window of opportunity and a sense of novelty. And I think we just want to make clear as a threshold matter that we are all painfully aware that women in Mexico are not alone in facing issues like wage inequality and sexual harassment, or the double shift, or the motherhood penalty, all these other issues. But the case study from Mexico is remarkable for many reasons. First being that the reality on the ground in Mexico runs somewhat counter to what trade theory would suggest. Second, that the opportunities that free trade brought to Mexico for women reinforce gender norms. The third, given the magnitude of these issues in Mexico compared to other countries, is significant. And fourth, NAFTA was being renegotiated at the time that we were developing this project, and so we found it to be a really opportune time to work on this, though we have no clue what's now going to happen with the USMCA. As some of the presenters will talk about, Mexico has started to implement some of the labor reforms that would happen because of USMCA. Bless you, Sam. Sam got a shout out for sneezing. In terms of the study design, it's qualitative. We began by broadly researching the topic of the intersection between free trade and human rights, of which generally free trade and human rights are siloed in law. And so we were trying to bridge that gap. We conducted a vast literature review. The students drafted different proposals. We evaluated those proposals and focused on this particular issue. Then we worked through the institutional review board to make sure that our interviews were conducted in a way that respected human subjects. We identified, reached out to stakeholders, and then conducted both our field interviews and interviews remotely. And once we gathered all this information, we analyzed it, corroborated it, followed up, depending on what the issue was, and ultimately this led to our outlining and drafting of the report, which we did share with stakeholders prior to the release to also incorporate their comments as well. So, which brings me to our research limitations, in that in no way should this report be representative of the experience of every woman in Mexico. And I think particularly we want to emphasize that there might be groups that are even more vulnerable, and we have to recognize that women in indigenous communities or the Afro-Mexican community or migrants might have additional barriers. So that's one limitation. Another was the lack of individual interviews with women who work in maquilas. We had a couple, but not enough to make any determinations. We had some logistical and what's the word for money? Resources, thank you. It's logistical and resource constraints that really prevented that. So our point of view is more institutional than based on what women might feel. And finally, another limitation is our focus. We are focused strictly on the maquila sector. And as some of you might very well know, the agricultural sector in Mexico took quite a hit with NAFTA. And there were a lot of different repercussions, including job loss and having to switch crops and issues related to cultural food sources. So that's a whole other issue in of itself. Also goes to the uneven development between the North and the South. So the South still remains underdeveloped. And if you're interested in agriculture, you can speak to Miranda after this report, who's working on that separately. So this brings me to the report, which is in a manageable 8 different parts that I'll just briefly outline before kicking it to the presenters. So the first part of our report outlines the political and economic history with a focus on the labor movement and trade. Then, because we're international law, we focus on the legal aspects, bless you, including Mexico's domestic, regional, and international legal obligations, mostly in relation to human rights law, but we also tackle their international legal framework for trade. Part 2 goes to applied economic theory. So you have to appreciate the fact that this is a very SAIS report in how much it actually integrates. And so with the applied economic theory, we are trying to set out a framework where we can analyze the relationship between trade and women in the workforce in Mexico. Part 3 goes on to discuss protection gaps in Mexico, of which largely focuses on some systemic issues, rule of law issues, corruption issues. You know, as I'm sure our presenters will note, Mexico has great laws on the books, like many places, but there's an enforcement issue. And in Mexico, the enforcement issue goes to capacity, lack of willingness, these corruption issues. And so that part goes on to talk about how, at least in the maquila sector, how private entities have stepped in to close some of those protection gaps. For example, the factory shuttle that I mentioned in the beginning would be something that the private sector might implement to make sure that women have secure transport back and forth to work. Part 4 goes into the gendered, cultural, and structural barriers. These are barriers that hinder the rights of women in the workforce, and this section most prominently covers the double shift, i.e. women working for money and then going home and working again for no money. So part 5 is where we get into our case study on the maquila specifically. And this part addresses both the opportunity that came with free trade, but also the costs of reinforcing these gender stereotypes. Part 6 discusses efforts by the government of Mexico, the civil society, private sector, to combat gender discrimination, with a particular focus on professional advancement. Part 7, almost there. Part 7 offers a brief conclusion, and we had several concluding thoughts. Among them, I think, was the importance of a gender perspective in free trade, as well as the significance of women in the labor force to economic development. And finally, Part 8 covers our policy recommendations, which the students will present, and it'll help contextualize the report. And so, right before I introduce the students, I just want to say or remind you that this is on the record and being video recorded. So once we get to Q&A, just know that you're on the record. And with that, I'd like to introduce my fabulous, hardworking team, starting with Lisa.
Thank you, Tiffany. My name is Lisa Nations, and I have the great honor of kicking off the policy recommendations. So just to give a little structure to how we're about to go forward, we start with the broadest, and then we try and go down to the most narrow. So we start in the international trading system and how Mexico places themselves in there. And then next we have recommendations for domestic institutions, and then finally we present private sector recommendations, which fit work inside the context of these domestic institutions. So to start off with the international trading system, just to give you all a brief history of how Mexico catapulted itself into this system, was first in the mid-1960s when they previously had completely protected industries under import substitution policies, but they did open one very specific industry, which Tiffany had mentioned, the maquiladoras. And these were export processing firms, and that was the only one that wasn't protected by import substitution policies. And then in the 80s, they shifted again to lower tariffs on all of their industries in order to be able to ascend to the general agreements on tariff and trade, which later became the WTO. And then finally, as I'm sure you all know, in 1994, NAFTA was ratified, which lowered the tariff barriers even further between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So in the face of the international pressures that are placed on Mexico due to this free trade system, we offer the following recommendations. So the first one is to implement strategies to mitigate the adverse effects of trade agreements on people's ability to enjoy their economic, social, and cultural rights. And so this policy rec came about because we found in our report that our overall findings were that women gained from trade in the fact that they were able to increase their economic participation. However, they increased their participation in difficult working conditions, in jobs that presented them with difficult working conditions. So it's hard to judge if it was overall welfare improving, depending on how you look at it. So between 1990 and 2005, there was an increase by 146% of women working in the labor force. And we, in our report, paid particular attention to the export processing firms because they overwhelmingly employed women, and the positives that they brought is that they were a formal channel for women to enter the labor force, but additionally, the gender wage gap that they face in the maquiladora sector is actually smaller than the wage gap that is faced by women in other industries of the economy. The adverse effects that came with joining this sector is that there's incredibly high turnover, particularly because women are employed on temporary contracts. It's an incredibly volatile industry, and actually the average educational attainment in this industry between 94 and 96 decreased for women, whereas in the rest of the economy, their educational attainment increased. So it's been shown that this decrease in educational attainment, along with the poor pay and work hours, has produced negative spillover effects into their children, particularly for the women working in this sector, which kind of keeps them in a vicious cycle of poverty. So as we all know, trade theory predicts aggregate gains for the economy, and so it's up to the domestic institutions to be able to take these gains and redistribute them amongst the population. So that's where this policy recommendation came from, was trying to understand what these adverse effects were so that they could be redistributed equitably once the gains hit the economy. So one such tool that we found that works on this is called the Human Rights Impact Assessment. And what these do is they identify and analyze, and in some cases monitor over time, the effects of a trade agreement on people's ability to enjoy their human rights. And so this is just one such example, but if Mexico were to want to do this in the future, the government needs to recognize the structural discrimination that women face when joining the labor force and the reality of the double shift, and make sure that once they entered free trade agreements, that these are kept in mind so that the gains are equitably spread amongst men and women. The second recommendation that we have is to increase the participation of diverse stakeholders in trade negotiations and increase transparency and dissemination mechanisms when entering negotiations of new trade agreements. So another thing that we found in our report that's really interesting was alongside this economic liberalization timeline, it's really interesting to see it in the context of the political liberalization of Mexico. So between the years of 1929 and 1997, there was one ruling party in power, the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, and so they had a monopoly over politics through coercive measures. So they bought votes and they cracked down on opposition parties. And so in 1996, which you'll note is obviously 2 years after the ratification of NAFTA, they finally enacted reforms that allowed it to be free and fair elections, which caused them to then lose the Congress and then the presidency later. So what this means, the fact that it was just one party in power, was that the trade negotiations and the whole economic liberalization process was done in a very top-down manner without any stakeholder negotiations or consultation before entering them. The PRI saw these trade agreements as quick ways to fix a stalling economy. And so then what happened is there's two problems that come about when you don't include important voices in the negotiation process and also in sort of the cost-benefit analysis of entering trade agreements. The first one is that things that were important to Mexico were not brought to the negotiating table with Canada and the United States. So women's voices weren't heard in these negotiations, and the policymakers just decided to do what they wanted to do. And the second thing is that people become unaware of what trade is responsible for providing and then what the domestic institutionals are responsible for protecting underneath these trade agreements. So we recommended this policy of negotiation, stakeholder contribution to the negotiations to be able to have a broader voice so that when agreements are ratified, they serve the greater purpose of the entire population and everyone's voices are represented in the negotiation process. And also that the thoughts of towards the multilateral free trading system would be more positive because people are very aware of the advantages that are supposed to be brought with trade and then what the potential disadvantages could be and how the domestic institutions are supposed to rectify those. So those are two of the international facing ones. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Miranda, who is going to offer the third.
Thanks, Lisa. So my name is Miranda, and I'm going to be talking about gendering trade agreements. So obviously, if you conduct consultations or you conduct a human rights impact assessment before trade negotiations go through, you should be able to come up with concrete language for trade agreements. You could also look at academic studies. So it's really important to include gendered language in trade agreements because if you don't mention it explicitly, it just goes under the radar. It's not going to come into effect. So as Lisa was talking about earlier, lowering barriers to trade has long been assumed to expand economic opportunities to women, as well as improve women's well-being in cultural, social, and political contexts. However, given the present case of Mexico, these intentions and beliefs didn't hold. Not only in our report, but other academics have concluded that women tend to be disproportionately impacted by the negative effects of trade liberalization, and therefore the rights, provisions, and language included in trade agreements, that it's important, especially to women and other vulnerable groups. So without the inclusion of explicit gendered language and provisions, women will continue to be left behind as trade barriers are lowered. So we recommend that Mexico should work to include explicit gendered language or gender chapters in future trade agreements, in addition to conducting human rights impact assessments and consultations. So this is actually a growing trend, including gender provisions in free trade agreements, especially in Latin America. Over 70 free trade agreements that are notified to the WTO include explicit gendered language In particular, Canada is taking the lead in including whole gender chapters in new trade agreements, including the renegotiated free trade agreement with Chile and Israel. Free trade agreements among Mercosur countries are also including robust gender policies. The USMCA does address gender-related issues, especially in the realm of labor and employment, such as the elimination of discrimination in employment and wages. The USMCA additionally mentions the promotion of SMEs owned by underrepresented groups, including women. However, when you look at these provisions, it's clear that the USMCA missed an opportunity to further promote and protect the rights of women. The language in the agreement is limited and focused on women in the workplace, but the impacts of NAFTA, as we'll talk about later, went far beyond the workplace, affecting women socially. So in the future, it's really important for Mexico to continue addressing the impacts of trade, especially the gendered impacts. Advancing gender equity requires gender mainstreaming, not only domestically, but in the context of international trade. And speaking of gender mainstreaming, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Stephanie, who will explain gender mainstreaming and give further recommendations on domestic gender mainstreaming. Yeah.
Great, thanks Miranda. So my name is Stephanie, and like Miranda said, I'm going to introduce now a second set of policy recommendations. These are more geared toward the domestic sector and specifically geared toward eliminating kind of this gender stereotyping and gender discrimination that includes within Mexico itself. So a little context before jumping off what Lisa had said. Before trade liberalization, we know that women did not really work outside the house in Mexico. This began to change as Mexico adopted this model of export-oriented industrialization. And as this happened, there was a huge expansion in employment opportunities for women in Mexico. So logically, people assumed that this expansion in employment opportunities would come with greater economic freedom and thus more household power. But we can see decades later that this wasn't really the case in Mexico. The increased employment of women didn't really lead to their complete autonomy because this restructuring of the economy was not accompanied by a societal restructuring of expectations and norms. So basically what happened is a new vulnerability was created for women. Gender norms and expectations did not shift, and this was kind of exacerbated by the underlying machismo culture that exists in Mexico. So what happened then is that women were not only expected to work outside the home, but were also assumed to be solely responsible for domestic household duties. So they had to cook, they had to clean, they had to take care of the children. And this did not change as they entered the formal sector and informal sector. So this begins the problem of the double shift that we've been talking about. In Mexico, they call it the doble jornada, which means that women have to shoulder two burdens, domestic and professional work. So in our report and in other research we saw, they refer to this as a double-edged sword of trade, because although new jobs brought economic autonomy, like a small level of it, they really didn't offer a fair and equal opportunity for economic and professional advancement for women. Okay. So that being said, we go into our first overarching recommendation, which is kind of a very broad recommendation, and then the other recommendations will kind of feed into how that will be achieved. So the first recommendation is for Mexico to continue and increase its policies of gender mainstreaming at all levels of government, local and as well as federal. And what gender mainstreaming is that gender issues become central to every single government practice that is implemented. So this includes legal practices, judicial practices, budgeting, policymaking. So everything that the government does has to account for the structural disadvantage that women face so that they are given an even playing field to be able to compete in the market. So the goal here is for the government to promote a stronger degree of sensitivity to women and gender issues so that women are no longer at a disadvantage. So obviously this is very, very difficult to do, but it has to begin with the government because the government is what sets the tone for the rest of society. So Mexico has already made some strides. Its 2014-2018 National Action Plan under former President Peña Nieto had gender inclusivity chapters, but it needs to be increased. The amount of money spent on this can be increased and should be increased in order to ensure that gender inclusivity happens across all levels of government. And to this end, the government has to stop replicating gender stereotypes that lead to exclusion and discrimination in the country. So lastly, to end, I would say that it's important to understand that gender mainstreaming is not the goal, it's just kind of a strategy so that you can build an institutional structure that promotes gender equality and makes it a central tenet of all its activities. Now, I'm gonna hand it over to my colleague Rachel, who will go a little more into detail how this can be done.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel, and I'm going to continue discussing gender-based recommendations. I'm going to discuss two different recommendations. So one aspect to keep in mind while discussing gender-based discrimination in Mexico is the prevalent machismo culture that can be found throughout the country. So we heard over and over again from the experts that we interviewed that many of the problems discussed in this report stem from this ingrained culture. So what is machismo? Machismo is the idea that men are dominant figures in the household and in the family and calls to mind masculinity, aggressiveness, and sexual virile characteristics. It often manifests in the suppression of women, particularly when they want to leave the house and do work outside of the home. It's also important to keep in mind for this recommendation that gender stereotypes are developed and ingrained at a very early age. So research actually indicates that by the age of 10, you've already ingrained particular stereotypes. So it's really necessary to address these cultural stereotypes early and to prevent the sustainment of this kind of machismo culture. So for this reason, we urge the Mexican government to overhaul educational materials and scholarly activities to ensure that there's a promotion of gender equality in all relevant academic activities. So first, we advocate for textbooks in schools to be rewritten to avoid sexism, such as pictures of women and girls doing domestic housework. Moreover, teachers should also have mandatory training in gender sensitivity, and this training needs to be open to the community at wide as well. Finally, there should be resources supplied to encourage young girls to enter STEM programs, fields which they are generally discouraged from. Notably, this is an issue prevalent around the world, but as many jobs in the future it will be necessary to have knowledge of STEM. It's really crucial that girls are given the opportunities to enter these fields and subjects. In our paper, we do discuss a program. It's called Niñas STEM Pueden, and it's a partnership between the OECD and the Mexican Ministry of Education. And it works to increase the number of female entrepreneurs and to help girls pursue STEM careers, and this has actually been pretty successful, so it can serve as a model moving forward for Mexico. So the next recommendation I'm going to discuss is also related to gender-based. So, and it's advocating for the creation of programs to inform working women in Mexico of their rights in the workplace and the restitution mechanisms available to them should these rights be violated. So in Mexico, many working women do not have knowledge of the rights afforded to them under Mexican law. As we were saying, Mexican law actually does have a lot of great laws on the books, but it's not necessarily implemented. What's more, many women don't know that there are reporting mechanisms as well in place for them, should these rights be violated. So if women are aware, they're sometimes hesitant to report for fear of retaliation by their bosses, which we discuss at length in the paper as well. So with programs in place to teach women about these protections and legal rights, the culture should shift as women are going to be reporting more and more, and bosses are going to know that their employees are aware of their rights. So one group we met with is actually doing this. The ILSB, has been running workshops like this to inform women of their rights, and they've also found that to be really successful. They've segmented it between different careers, so they have one program or workshop for women in the agricultural sector. They have one for women that are artisans, and so they found that to be successful, and that can also be a model. So the Mexican government should develop targeted and tailored outreach programs to teach women about their workplace rights and combat discrimination. Finally, this will require partnering with civil society organizations because the Mexican government can't do this by themselves. These are groups that President AMLO has threatened to cut funding in the past. So it's critical that the Mexican government maintain support for these groups and continue the funding. So those are those two recommendations. I'm going to pass it on to Fernanda now to talk about more gender-based recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name is Fernanda, and I will be talking about gender sensitivity training for law enforcement. And as my colleague Rachel mentioned, many women are unaware of their rights in the workplace. This also holds true when talking about gender-based violence. So gender-based violence is prevalent in Mexico. For example, in the workplace in 2015 and 2016, over 220 claims of gender-based discrimination were made, with over half being against women. Domestic violence or intimate partner violence is also a norm, with over 44% of women having experienced it. And in Mexico, an average of 7 women a day are murdered due to their gender. As we found in our report, Mexico has international and domestic obligations to prevent gender-based violence and to promote and protect women's rights. However, due to cultural stereotypes, fear of backlash, and unfamiliarity of their rights, women tend to not report these types of crimes. For example, about 14% of women in Latin America report these crimes. Thus, the numbers that I just stated could actually be completely incorrect and could be higher. As mentioned in our report, Mexico has begun to implement policies to combat these issues. The Gendered Violence Alert System seeks to address femicide and gender-based violence. As the alert system stands today, though, it's only run through each state. It's state-centric, so each state has the authority to declare an alert and decide how to address it or how to implement the programs. Thus, we recommend that Mexico adopt a federal policy of gender sensitivity training for law enforcement. The idea behind this is that to better equip law enforcement to handle these types of crimes and to stop reinforcing gender stereotypes so that women can safely report these types of crimes. If women do not report these crimes, a culture of impunity will continue to exist, and we will not be able to enhance our understanding of violence against women in Mexico. Mexico can look to international organizations such as UNICEF or ActionAid for tools to implement these types of gender sensitization programs. Part of this could also be including more female police officers. So studies have shown that including women as police officers and gender sensitization programs does actually encourage women to report gender-based violent crimes. So women have the right to seek justice for crimes against their gender, crimes ingrained in machismo culture. Thus, the least the state can do is create an environment in which women are able to report these types of crimes. Now I will pass it on to Karen to continue talking about gender issues in Mexico.
Thank you, Fernanda. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Karen, and I'll continue this conversation talking about gender-based discrimination in the workplace. So Mexico has actually made progress in its efforts to eradicate gender-based discrimination by enacting laws and signing to international conventions on the protections of the rights of women. However, as Fernanda said, there's still a problem with law enforcement in the country. We went in January to Mexico to talk to stakeholders who work with the protection and advocacy of women's rights, especially in the maquila sector. And what we learned is that there's still a lot of gender-based discrimination in the maquila. Some of these gender-based discriminations are easier to be identified. Some of them might be a little bit more difficult to be identified. And if they are a little bit more difficult to be identified, it also means that they are difficult to remedy. So let me give you a few examples of the types of gender-based discriminations that we learned about while talking to stakeholders in Mexico. So one example is forced pregnancy tests, which is actually illegal under Mexican federal labor law. Who has heard about forced pregnancy tests here before? So let me give you a brief explanation. So in Mexico, sometimes before a woman is hired, they are obligated to do a pregnancy test. And that actually violates the rights to privacy, and it's clearly gender-based discrimination. Sometimes, even after they are hired, they have to continue doing this pregnancy test to prove to their employers that they are not pregnant. And why does that matter to the employers? That matters to the employers because under the law, there are certain requirements that an employer needs to meet, and these kind of requirements ended up increasing the cost for the firm, such as paid maternity leave, for example. The number of pregnancy tests has decreased significantly in the past few years, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So it still exists, but at a lesser degree. Another example is that if you look at the managerial and leadership positions in the maquila sector, you see that the majority of these positions are actually occupied by men. So a first thing that might come into your mind is why? And an easy solution might be, oh, maybe women are less educated than men. But if you actually look at statistics on higher education in Mexico for men and women, you see that the gender gap is only about 2%. So it's very small. And even if women in the macular sector was less educated than men, doesn't mean that the firm couldn't be implementing and training opportunities for women to be more qualified to be in those leadership positions. Something else that we learned that is really related to this problem is that some of the women that are able to achieve those positions, they're accused of paying sexual favors for their bosses because they believe that's the only way they were able to achieve this position, which kind of goes into what Rachel was talking about, the machismo culture. So as I mentioned before, there are some types of gender-based discriminations that are much easier to be identified and some that are difficult to be identified. And those that are difficult are also difficult to remedy. So what would be our recommendation? So our recommendation is based on the Shadow Report on Employment Discrimination Against Women in Mexico, and we suggest the creation of a national survey, similar to what already exists here in the United States, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Survey, where employers have to submit information about their workforce, disaggregated by sex, race, etc. And the commission responsible for implementing the survey, collecting the data, would be also responsible for analyzing patterns of gender-based discrimination. And if they find something, they would talk to these firms, and if there's actually in fact evidence that gender-based discrimination is occurring in the workplace, though this commission should have the authority to fine those firms. We believe that this mechanism has the potential to help the government better identify gender-based discrimination in the workplace and better implement solutions to eradicate this issue. So now I'll pass to my colleague Dania, who's going to be talking a little bit more about gender-based discriminations on maternity leave. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank you guys for coming out as well. I'm Danielle, and I'm going to be presenting a little bit more of some of the gender-based discrimination that we encountered. And currently, one of our recommendations that we put forward is to extend and enforce paid maternity leave and paternity leave. Right now, under Mexican federal labor law, it has stipulations for paid maternity and paternity leave. However, there is an enforcement issue with this. Currently, Mexico is the second shortest leave entitlement for all mothers, just after the U.S. Currently in Mexico, women, when it is actually applied, women are granted 12 weeks of leave, 6 weeks occurring before and 6 weeks occurring after birth. And this is far below the OECD average for maternity leave, which is why one of our main recommendations is that this maternity leave this time period should be extended. Because without it, women need time after labor to, recover, spend time with their families, and bond with their child. And by extending paid maternity leave for women, it can have a positive impact in decreasing the gender disparity that we see in Mexico. If without this extension, women are forced to go back as quickly as possible after childbirth, or often they can risk losing their job if they are not able to return. We found often that lower income families are most affected by this because lower income families are often they're reliant on dual incomes for the household, so therefore without proper maternity leave, these women are forced to go back early or lose their job. We also recommend that paternity leave should be extended as well, as we believe this extension of paternity leave will also reduce discrimination when hiring women. This is because often when an employer is, as Karen had mentioned, with the forced pregnancy testing, they're doing it because they're worried about this component of offering paid maternity leave. So by extending paid paternity leave, this will also kind of destigmatize the role of men in child rearing and also reduce the gender discrimination in hiring. As an employer is looking at both hiring a male or female, they're going to have similar fees and contributions as well as leave time for both employees versus just discriminating against the woman. This, as I mentioned before, extending this paternal leave will also kind of reduce that traditional role that is influenced by the machismo culture, as women are the only primary caregivers of children. By having a longer paid paternity leave, it will also, promote that men should also contribute to this as well. So those are some of our main policy recommendations around gender discrimination, and now we're going to be moving into some more broad protection gaps that are across the spectrum. It applies to both men and women, but it's issues that we see significantly across the board. One of the main ones, and it kind of ties back into the paid maternity and paternity and maternity leave, is increasing fines for companies failing to enroll their employees in the Social Security system. So per the Constitution, Social Security benefits are a requirement and the right of any worker. each employer is required per law to register that employee within 5 days of hiring, so they can access these benefits. The issue that we encountered while we were on the ground is that often companies are failing to report their hiring of these employees and register them. Therefore, although it's unconstitutional, it puts these workers at a disadvantage as they're outside of that there's a protection gap there as they're not able to access these services if they're not enrolled. We found out this particular practice is even more common among the maquila sector. So it's often a larger issue there. The reason why employers are failing to register their employees is because they are trying to avoid paying the very high employer contributions, and often the minimal fine that they face for failing, if they get caught even to begin with, is much reduced compared to actually contributing normally by registering their employee. So as I mentioned before, if they fail to register in their employee, this restricts the access for both men and women to these services. So it's critical that this is corrected. And even if the penalties are higher for this, and it does get increased, it goes back to an enforcement issue, as Tiffany had mentioned earlier. A lot of this goes back to enforcement, is making sure that these employers are not only getting enrolled, but then and applying a larger fine, but also making sure that there's a proper number of labor inspectors that are able to go and enforce these regulations. So I will pass it off to my colleague Miranda to give a little bit more on the protection gaps.
Hello again. So I'm going to talk a little, thanks Danielle. I'm going to talk a little bit about unions. So unions have a long and complex history in Mexico, and the right to effectively participate in collective bargaining with your employer has long been an issue. This past month, that has kind of changed actually. Mexico passed some labor reforms to come into compliance with ILO conventions and the USMCA. So in the process of writing our report, this recommendation, is a little bit more complicated. So instead of talking about unions now, instead of talking about the right to form a union, I'm gonna talk about the leadership makeup of unions. So of particular interest to our research, the current union system is primarily led by women, despite relatively equal rates of participation across gender. Leadership of unions should reflect the participation in current Mexican labor market, which includes obviously a large percentage of women. The absence of women in union leadership is a common problem throughout the world, including the United States and Canada. Mexico is certainly not an outlier in this respect, but considering the extent of discrimination and gender violence women face in the workplace, union leadership may be pivotal to closing the wage gap and ending gender discrimination in Mexico. For export-driven businesses, for international businesses coming into Mexico, it's a requirement to have a union to have an official union. Generally, these were called paper unions and didn't actually effectively represent the workers there. They were really just a paper agreement between a union and a employer, and workers were generally not able to effectively participate. This new legislation allows the formation of independent unions and secures the right to effectively bargain in Mexico. So in doing this new legislation offers an opportunity to reform the union system and possibly include the opportunity to expand female leadership. But it will take both unions, businesses, and the Mexican government to press for further union reform. One way that you could do this is augmenting female participation in union leadership could be achieved by creating female-led committees on women's participation in leadership in unions themselves, but also creating special bodies in the government to tackle female representation. These women's committees could be pivotal in training in leadership skills and offering mentoring as well as networking opportunity for women to achieve a higher status in their union. So now I'm going to hand this off to Anna, and she can talk some more about labor inspection in Mexico.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Miranda. My name is Anna. I'm going to be following up with our last recommendation on the subject of state protection gaps. So as Lisa mentioned earlier, after NAFTA went into effect in Mexico, there was a huge increase in the number of women working, as well as the number of maquiladoras in the country. The number of maquiladoras actually doubled in the few years after NAFTA went into effect. So there was this huge increase in work sites and workers, and this presented a huge challenge for the Mexican government in terms of proper regulation of these workspaces through labor inspections, and this is a challenge that they've yet to overcome today. Notably, Mexico has neither signed nor ratified the International Labor Organization's Labor Inspection Convention, which has been ratified by 146 countries. According to one expert with whom we spoke, Mexico has only 10% of the ILO's recommended number of labor inspectors. Currently, there are only 521 federally employed labor inspectors in the entire country of Mexico. 56 of these serve in Mexico City. Local governments can employ additional numbers of labor inspectors. However, this tends to be a relatively low number. Mexico City's Secretary of Labor employs an additional 16 labor inspectors, meaning that there's a total of 72 labor inspectors for Mexico City, which is a city of 8.8 million people. And this low number of labor inspectors means that these inspectors only have the capacity to carry out inspections at a limited number of work sites per year, and that they don't have the capacity to carry out thorough inspections at these work sites. And this means there's a major challenge in ensuring that the rights of women are protected in these workspaces. The Mexican federal government does plan to increase the number of labor inspectors in the coming year. According to the same expert with whom we spoke that gave us the 10% statistic, the federal government plans to increase the number of labor inspectors to 50% of the ILO's recommended number, which is certainly an improvement, and we applaud that plan. However, we recommend a more holistic plan in terms of improving the labor inspection situation. In terms of hiring more labor inspectors, we hope to see the different levels of Mexican government working cooperatively to ensure that they're increasing the number of labor inspectors in a way that is even throughout the country, so we don't have certain areas that have plenty of labor inspectors, other areas that don't have enough labor inspectors for those work sites. In addition, all of these levels of governments must ensure that these labor inspectors are trained adequately and that there's a gender perspective to these trainings so that labor inspectors are aware of the different risks that women face in the workplace versus the ones that men face. Additionally, the Mexican government should increase the transparency regarding the number of labor inspectors that it employs. While we were doing this research, we found that the data was not available online at the federal level, at the local level, nor is the data publicly available from organizations such as the ILO, which other countries do have the number of labor inspectors published on the ILO's website. All of the statistics that I cited above, we got directly from the Secretary of Labor in Mexico City. So as Mexico works to increase the number of labor inspectors, it should ensure that this information is publicly available and easily accessible in order to create full transparency. So now we're going to move on from the subject of state protection gaps. And in addition to the policy recommendations that we've issued thus far, all of which have been directed toward the public sector, we would also like to offer several policy recommendations to the private sector. Of course, the private sector was one of the major stakeholders that we identified in our research, and we would be loath to discuss the human rights situation of women working in Mexico in the context of free trade without acknowledging the role that the private sector can play in improving this situation. The first of these recommendations has to do with the safety issues that many workers in Mexico face simply traveling to and from their places of work. Mexico struggles with a weak rule of law, particularly in the northern parts of the country and the border regions along the border with the United States. Consequently, many Mexicans find it dangerous simply to travel to and from work due to the violence that can ensue while they're doing so. And this issue is magnified for women as illustrated in a 2009 case in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights regarding 3 young women who were murdered during their travels to work and school in Ciudad Juarez, where their bodies were discovered in a cotton field, along with the bodies of multiple other women. Female workers may be dissuaded from pursuing employment due to these dangers and may instead choose to pursue the traditional roles of wife and mother. And when women cannot travel to work because of safety concerns, if they would like to pursue work but can't because of this, not only does this have a negative effect on the ability of women to exercise their rights, but it also negatively affects the productivity of Mexico because if they are losing potential labor because of the inability of people to travel to work, this means missed opportunities for GDP growth. And private sector employers can play a leading role in solving this issue. Companies operating in Mexico should take steps to ensure the safety of their workers during their travels to and from work by exploring options such as arranging company transport for workers. In order to understand the optimal ways to help their employees with this safe travel, companies should organize focus groups or conduct surveys with employees to determine the best way that they can assist them. Special emphasis should be placed on the safety of female employees, as they are often at higher risk than their male counterparts when it comes to transportation. And I do want to highlight that this can also be beneficial to the companies by showing their support for women in the community. This can foster goodwill within the community, which is beneficial always in terms of building better trust with employees, potentially leading to higher retention of workers, perhaps greater productivity on the part of these workers. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Katherine now, who's going to round out this discussion of recommendations for the private sector.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Katherine Tyson. And as Anna discussed previously, of course, the private sector is an integral part of any discussion on trade and human rights, particularly in Mexico, and the given number of multinational corporations that source from factories in Mexico and have their own operations based there. An additional recommendation that we came up with concerns some of the issues around the social compliance audits that Anna had discussed previously, namely that multinational corporations specifically should increase the use of third-party private social compliance auditing firms in order to monitor conditions at their Mexican factories. To provide a bit of context around the landscape of social compliance auditing in Mexico, in addition to the Public Labor Inspectorate, there are several private firms that operate in Mexico. And we actually had interviews with one such firm that has a pretty expansive operation in Mexico. And these firms are privately contracted with multinational corporations, and they typically conduct more audits, greater in quantity, but they also tend to apply a more rigorous standard against Mexican labor law when doing so. As a point of comparison, in 2018, the Public Labor Inspectorate conducted approximately 360 audits in labor sites countrywide. The single private firm that we spoke with conducted 2,400. So certainly there's not only a greater quantity of work sites that can be covered by the employment of these firms, but also based on, also there's a higher quality of audit that's being conducted, particularly as we learned that the state audits have a reputation of not always discovering violations or discovering violations but not necessarily giving a failing grade to a work site, essentially allowing them to continue. So in this greater context, with the understanding that state labor enforcement capacity will likely be constrained in the near term, we recommend that multinational corporations either increase their level of participation with private social compliance firms for those that do have those relationships established already, but that there are still multinational corporations operating in Mexico that don't have these relationships. And there are plenty of firms, they're very public about their presence, and it's very easy to establish these relationships and just continue to fill the gap that exists in state enforcement of labor protections. And additionally, the final recommendation that we have for the private sector is instituting corporate governance measures to promote gender balance in management positions, as well as prevent sexual harassment in the general workplace. As has been discussed by my colleagues previously, a lot of the pervasive gender discrimination issues are both in behavior exhibited towards female employees, but also just in the presence or lack thereof of women in management positions. The private sector definitely has a lot of capacity to change this, even within their own operations. In particular, we spoke with a representative from Caterpillar, which is the world's largest construction equipment manufacturer and does a lot of their manufacturing in Mexico. And they're actually doing a lot of such actions that can be considered best practices and certainly provide a blueprint for a lot of other companies to follow. Particularly, Caterpillar is reinforcing human resources policies on rooting out sexual harassment, and they're adopting policies to enable greater work schedule flexibility, particularly to accommodate working mothers. And they also have established a special employee group that guides women, hoping to advance in their careers at Caterpillar and increase the ranks of women in management positions. And while Caterpillar seems to be the only company that is publicly reporting activities specifically in this sphere, that certainly doesn't preclude the possibility that other companies are doing this but not publicizing it, but we certainly recommend that other companies follow in their footsteps. And that concludes our recommendations, and I'm going to hand it back to Stephanie.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. So now I'm just going to do a brief wrap-up. As you can see by the depth and breadth of our recommendations, there's a lot of work to be done in Mexico. It's obvious that the gains of trade have not been evenly distributed, and in some cases, they have either exacerbated pre-existing issues or underlying issues, or even created new ones, especially with women. So the second shift in particular presents a huge challenge for Mexico and is kind of the overarching theme of our report. And it's also worth noting that this is a global problem. Women in the U.S. also face this issue. So what's next? There are a lot of changes up in the air right now in Mexico. AMLO, the president of Mexico, brought a lot of energy to workers' rights issues and has enacted some significant changes in Mexico recently within the last year. So there have been increases in minimum wage. There has been some Social Security reform related to domestic workers. And there have been changes in collective bargaining. So these are all positive developments in Mexico that we need to look out for. That being said, there are some preoccupying developments as well. Like Rachel mentioned before, AMLO has expressed open disdain for civil society and has even defunded civil society in Mexico just in February. So this is extremely preoccupying because civil society is essential to building a robust democracy that ensures representation from different groups within a society. So this is also something to look out for, especially considering that most of our recommendations need the aid of civil society in order to pan out. Furthermore, the overarching theme of our report is this intersection between women, human rights, and trade. So we know that NAFTA was kind of one of the most transformative events in modern history of Mexico. So we need to kind of mention what's going on with that. When we started this project in September, USMCA, which is NAFTA 2.0, seemed like kind of a done deal. And now we see that this is not necessarily the case. So there has been a lot of resistance to it. The legislatures of the three countries have not yet ratified it. So this is something we need to look out for because whatever happens with USMCA is sure to have defining repercussions for Mexico and for the livelihoods of women in Mexico, considering the connection that exists between them. So to wrap up, final thoughts, are women better off overall? Yes and no. So we have to recall the intersectionality of women's experiences and that different groups are affected in different ways. But it is for sure that women have had to shoulder a burden that was not theirs to bear alone. And they have not been relieved of this societal inequality that is ingrained in government practices, that is ingrained in private sector practices, that is ingrained in family life and in education. So in that case, they are not better off. So it is up to the government, civil society, and the private sector to take action in tandem to correct for that mistake. And with that, we're going to open for Q&A. Thank you.
Hey, where are you?
So you mentioned a lot about the double shift. I was wondering why you don't have any, like, present any specific recommendations, specifically addressing that issue.
Okay. So basically, the thing with a double shift is that you can't just present one recommendation that can solve the problem. You can't just force men to take care of domestic activities. You can't. You can try. So I guess our idea coming into this is that all the recommendations that we gave, if implemented together, can contribute to kind of lessening the unfair burden that women have at the home. And this idea of gender mainstreaming across all levels of society and of government will ideally lead to a decrease in gender stereotypes that exist in Mexico, and then will hopefully decrease kind of this unfair burden and this unfair expectation that women have, that they have to take care of things in the home and contribute to the family income at the same time. So it's kind of a long-term goal. You can't just fix it overnight, which is why all of our policy recommendations were kind of addressing certain issues that affect women individually, but then in the aggregate can help change kind of the societal perspective. Ma'am.
Rachel, thank you all so much. Really fascinating. My question is about the role of civil society organizations and the international community. You talked a bit, there was a partnership between the OECD and the Mexican government. I don't know the exact one, but there is international partnership. I guess my question is, do the United States and Canada, for example, by entering this agreement, entering NAFTA or USMCA with Mexico, have somewhat of a responsibility to ensure that the gains that they are getting from this, that they are mitigating the negative impacts of that in any of the poorest of the countries. And specifically, did you find that there were programs or partnerships with funded by either the U.S. or Canada to help civil society organizations, specifically in light of decreasing support from Mexico?
Yeah, I can. So to answer your question, no. There was, I mean, not to say that it doesn't exist, but we did not come into, we didn't find any programs throughout our research, and none of the stakeholders that we met with mentioned any of those programs. Most of the programs, as we mentioned, mostly take form with international organizations. Which that means then the US and Canada could be present in those organizations, but it's not a direct partnership, I guess, in those senses.
I will also add, do you want to actually add to that? You might know more.
No, I have a related question,
Okay.
but I'm happy to add to it. I work at the Commerce Department on Mexico and was involved in the USMCA negotiations, so was very interested to see this report. And something that we're looking at right now is the passage of Mexico's labor reforms and how that meets their labor commitments in the agreement. And so I think the main concern now is implementation of those reforms. And there's been a lot of conversation at the Hill on how involved the U.S. will be in monitoring that implementation. And the Mexican government has said, well, no, we are responsible for implementing our own reforms. We don't want you to be involved in that, which is a sovereignty thing, and that's an understandable thing. So I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on what they should be doing to implement this, whether it should be international organizations that should be involved. If you have any, I know it's all very different, but I don't know if you would include that.
Labor inspectors.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, primarily, it's an enforcement issue. So even if they're going to change, they have changed their labor laws. Compliance is a big problem. And I think we see that most in the avenue of labor inspectors who could remedy some of these labor issues. So I think until they build up capacity, but also better the rule of law, decrease corruption, things like that, I think it's going to be really difficult to implement.
Yeah. To add to that, I mean, it certainly is an ongoing discussion amongst ourselves. I mean, in my view, certainly there's an opportunity for US and Canada to influence some amount of implementation through their own conversations and relationships with corporations that are based and headquartered in their countries. Particularly a lot of US corporations that operate in Mexico but are currently not very engaged in labor protection mechanisms, or as I mentioned, even using social compliance auditing firms at all. I mean, those are certainly conversations could be had. In all honesty, I'm not sure how politically palatable it is currently, but that's certainly an area of opportunity that I see.
Well, first, I would also just like to clarify that, so what AMLO has said about civil society is that he wants to defund civil society organizations because he believes that the Mexican government itself can handle a lot of those issues. So there are, for example, in the Mexican government, there's the National Institute of Women and Mujeres that we spoke with a lot. And there's also, there's another sector that does the National Commission to Eradicate and Prevent Violence Against Women. There's also, as Rachel mentioned, programs that the Ministry of Education has already implemented. So I think in his understanding, a lot of what civil society is doing and should continue to do, he believes that the Mexican government themselves can do it. But as we've said, I've already mentioned, there's a lot of enforcement issues, so that is something that'll be interesting, I guess, to see in the coming months.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think it's kind of like Mexico. I don't know if we said this or not, but Mexico has really good laws on the books in terms of gender protection. Even their constitution, which was written in 1917, had already calls for paid maternity leave and things like that. So the laws are there, but like Fernanda said, it's an issue of implementation. And I think there are a lot of people in the Mexican government that want to see these changes enacted. We spoke to the Ministry of the Economy, and they were very adamant about gender mainstreaming, about including gendered languages in trade agreements. So there's a lot of people that really want to do this, but I think it's kind of the societal kind of misunderstanding of equality between men and women that kind of leads to a lack of actual action. And then in terms of AMLO and civil society, just jumping off of what Fernanda said, the argument is that civil society is corrupt. So how it used to work is the government would give civil society money, and then civil society would enact certain programs. And what AMLO said was that civil society was just taking the money. So what happened since February is now the money is supposed to be given directly to beneficiaries and cutting out the middleman, which is civil society, which I could kind of understand because there is a lot of corruption in Mexico and it's endemic to the society, but at the same time, without civil society to form these connections and to form these bonds between the government and the people, it's really difficult to get anything done.
I would just also add that, and those are all great points, that Mexico's a federal government, so you could see maybe not as much leadership at the federal level, but you could see it at the state level, because we met with, I think it was the labor ministry for Mexico City in of itself, and they seem to be keen on tackling these issues and research. So I think much like climate change in the US, you can see action at a lower level that is productive and leadership there.
Councilor Gardner?
Well, first of all, job really well done. You guys covered lots of excellent points. I was very happy to see the little business there because Catherine and Anna really did make the point. But I think one of the levers, one of the useful levers here are the multinational corporations, and many of them are Americans. And another lever may be to investors asking about
Yes, that's an interesting question. They actually just developed the database when, like, very recently before we visited in January. So it was a collaboration between In Mujeres that Fernanda was talking about and INEGI, which is their, like, national statistics body, and then UN Women helped as well. So they, yeah, so
But
it's
it's
very
very-
new, yeah.
Okay, because the other thing that's very interesting, another wrinkle, is that the head of the OECD, the executive director, is Mexican. Mexico is part of the OECD, and they are the first to really have developed with a phenomenal talent. Eva Giovannini did the first time gender disaggregate statistics database for the OECD. So the question is, would there be some way of training or really providing support? Because you can't enable government programs if you can't track the statistics. Question on maternity leave. I'm very glad you brought up maternity leave. Maternity leave, in my experience, has been a double-edged sword. You ask for more maternity leave, and then, of course, employers don't want to hire more women because it's like, oh, they're going to be a drag. So how, I mean, is there serious discussion about male paternity leave? Was that a proposal that you all had? Because, we're having trouble even in the United States or Europe. That's a trouble. And then the thing is, would you suggest that they enforce it? Because our Indian men don't even take maternity leave because of the culture. That's an issue.
Yeah, you bring up a great point. So under current federal law in Mexico, it is required that both there is maternity and paternity leave. But again, it goes back to the issue of enforcement. Like you said, not necessarily men are taking it, but we figured that would be one of the ways to reduce the gender gap is if men are also to kind of get at, again, like the double-edged sword that we're talking about. With the context of the machismo culture, like you said, most men will not take advantage of that, or if they do, it's going to be very limited time. But we thought by pushing for more paternity leave and extending that, it would not only help, enforce and, promote men's role as caregivers to their children, but it would also help reduce discrimination in hiring practices. So a lot of the times, if you're looking at hiring an individual and if they have a child that they're both taking the same amount of leave, you have the same amount of costs associated with that employee, in the hiring mechanisms would be the gender gap would be greatly reduced, and that was some of the reason that we were arguing for that aspect.
I wanted to ask you about what Tiffany mentioned earlier, how you did not get the opportunity to interview with enough women. And so when you did get the opportunity to interview with women and also men that were not necessarily like in charge of another institution, or they were working and they were in lines of the people that were impacted. So how did they respond to the effects that women have to deal with because of that shift? Were they accepting of changes that were required?
Okay, so I can speak to speaking to women. We spoke to one woman in particular who was very candid in her response. She worked in the maquilas for years, and now she heads kind of a civil society organization that advocates for women's rights within the maquilas in the north of Mexico. And she was very candid about the difficulties that women experience in both at home and at work, and how they promote kind of a vicious cycle of poverty for women and for their children, especially those in the maquiladora sector. And she told us a lot of very, I think, impactful anecdotes about the issues that women face, right? So minimum wage in Mexico is extremely, extremely low. It has not kept up to par with inflation, and so it does not really buy the basic basket of goods that you need. So for example, women in the north, she told us about this, who work in the maquilas, have to pick up side jobs in order to make ends meet. So for example, you're very close to the border with the US, so a lot of women cross the border to sell their blood or their plasma to US centers that pay $50 to do that in order to just be able to buy food for their children. So it's like a very, very common practice that women have had to figure out ways in which to now contribute to their household income, because now that's the expectation, because wages in Mexico have not made it so that a single income is enough to live. But at the same time, they have to go home, they have to care for their children, they have to do homework with them, they have to clean the house, and then they have to go pick up a back-to-back shift in a maquila. So she speaks about this in terms of how this affects their children. So if you're a mom that has to work in the maquila, has to cross the border to sell your blood, has to come back and clean the house, then you're not going to spend time doing homework with your child. You're not going to spend time making sure your child is going to school. And then your child is probably going to drop out of school and find a job in a maquila as well. And then the cycle continues. So I think we were missing some more anecdotes from women, but the women that we did speak to who kind of have experienced this have a very kind of depressed outlook of what's happening in Mexico and are very unhappy with the government and with the free trade agreements in general, because they have, she said unequivocally, after NAFTA, the lives of women are worse off in what she sees. So it's very difficult when you actually speak to women who have to go through this in their everyday lives. Maria?
So in terms of generally, you find in other places when women do have economic opportunities, and it was mentioned before that before they just stayed basically at home and work outside the home. But things like child marriage rates decrease, things like domestic violence rates decrease, because people can leave like abusive relationships, even if it's not the best economic opportunity, people leave that relationship. I was wondering if you guys can speak to that. Did you see any of that about like specifically like issues with like child marriage, like early pregnancy, domestic violence? Was that impacted by free trade at all?
Well, we did look into intimate partner violence and then also adolescent pregnancy rates, and Mexico has one of the highest adolescent pregnancy rates in the OECD. And I don't, unless, do you want to?
I think it dropped. So adolescent pregnancy did drop after they entered into NAFTA. One interesting thing is intimate partner violence might have increased, but okay, so it's kind of a complicated relationship. So as women became breadwinners in the household, men, I think, felt that this is what the research says, is that men became threatened and intimate partner violence increased. However, some people think that maybe just reporting of intimate partner violence, like the reporting mechanisms got better. So it's kind of a complicated relationship.
It's hard to disaggregate the data in that sense, but overall, I would say intimate partner violence we did find like generally was higher, but to say it was directly correlated to trade, it's a little bit difficult to say that exactly because of the compounding factors like Miranda was mentioning. There's lots of things that have changed in that aspect.
It's also a fine line because what the research was indicating is that as women's income increased, there was a threshold, right? So the violence, it started again. So when they started earning more than the men, and so it's a very it's a balance, and so that's what we were finding more of. Yeah.
And it depends on education levels and obviously your socioeconomic status.
Yeah. And you have to consider, again, the machismo culture is so very prevalent in Mexico. I mean, I don't want to say more than other Latin American countries, but, different. It's very strong, and so it is hard to leave your partner because of that ingrained cultural spirit.
And like Rachel mentioned, as soon as the female of the household was earning a higher income, that kind of led to additional violence, and that plays back into the machismo culture. As the man is supposed to be the breadwinner of the family and bring home all the income, and so that was one of the factors that we saw.
And in terms of educational increase, there's been a huge educational increase in Mexico. I think I think even more women go to college than men at this point. But it's kind of like this underlying culture of like, you're a woman, you're supposed to stay at home, and you're going to make less than a man. So the gender wage gap is huge in Mexico as well. So it's like we said, it's a double-edged sword. Like, yes, opportunities have increased, but they're not on a level playing field. So women still make less than men, even though they're working. Women still experience sexual harassment in the workplace more than men do. Women still experience violence more than men do because of these societal expectations that kind of say, the man is the leader of the house, the man is the breadwinner of the house. And it's still, even for women themselves, they themselves replicate these gender stereotypes. So women are surveyed, and we saw in our research where they say, like, who is expected to clean the house? And they say women are. right? So even women themselves have this ingrained thing, which goes back to Rachel's recommendation of education and like kind of trying to tackle this from when you're a child in order to kind of stop this from happening.
I would also just briefly add, before we conclude, because we're out of time, that the freedom that comes with a dual income is really cultural. For example, I think there's studies that women spend more money on their children, right? So this dual income, the women might be spending more on their children. Last year when we did a report on Uganda, the dual income households, it was the province of the women's income to take care of the house and the children, and the men do what they want with the income, right? And so there's still not that freedom to leave or to move on or to have these options if that's how the gender norms are ingrained and how the money's spent. So, but with that, I think we just want to thank everybody for coming today and thank our presenters for all their hard work over the past year. And you can find our report online, as well as a number of different blogs on various topics that are also online and really interesting, from child labor to drug trafficking to agriculture. I'm missing like 7 of them, but those. And we will have a reception following this. Just give us a minute or two to set up, and you can enjoy some Mexican food and some Mexican Coca-Cola.
And very briefly, we just wanted to say thank you to Tiffany Basciano, who was the kind of leader of this project and who created the Human Rights Clinic 8 years ago, I think, and we really helped her.
That's what I told you.
We really thank her because this has been a really great experience and a great experiential experience and a huge part of the ILAW program at SAIS. So we wanted to thank her for all of her contributions as well.